I've got a lot to cover, and so I have to apologize that we're going to be going really fast through a lot of material, but you're going to enjoy this journey with me. We're going to start by taking a little trip back, looking at how has human society evolved over several different societal shifts. Because that's going to tell us a little bit about, first, what is this fractal pattern? And I'll explain a little bit further what I mean by fractal. By the end of this, you'll be able to talk about two things that are very common in all fractal patterns. They're self-similar and they're iterative. And we'll look at what that means. But this fractal pattern in society is you get from a point where society's evolved to a certain level and the models and institutions that are there prove to be insufficient. A set of cross-discipline breakthroughs has to happen, and previously unimaginable concepts emerged. These reimagined structures and institutions then take over. Now, this has happened many, many times already, and I want to point out three big examples that you're probably all familiar with, but you haven't thought about. First was when the agrarian age began. There were some concepts that did not exist prior to agriculture. The idea of settlement, because when we were hunter-gatherers, we did not settle any place. There was no town. Feudalism, this idea that you're going to have this kind of area of protection around this agricultural land. Even the idea of private ownership was completely inconceivable until it happened, right? These were new human constructs. And by the way, I want to point out each time that we have one of these, I'm using the word renaissance, but what happens is you reach the end of the mild conditions that everybody understands, you get into wild conditions. And we're going to talk, because we're in a period with lots of different wild conditions. There are also areas where there's mild conditions still exist, but this is where life exists, is in that space in between. What happened at the beginning of the industrial age, right? We actually, people worry about the robotic life forms taking over in the future, right? We created life forms in the form of the corporation, in the form of the nation, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. If you're worried about taking life forms and inflicting them out on the world, you're way too late. That horse left hundreds of years ago when we formed the corporation, when we formed the concept of a nation, because individual people can die off, and yet that organism still lives on, right? We already dealt with this problem. We haven't solved it. We're actually dealing with a lot of the consequences of it right now. But these concepts did not exist prior to the industrial age, and we can't imagine life without them today, right? Science, another example of this. Now we're in the network age. How do we know this? Because we have had a whole bunch of massive changes that were completely unimaginable before they happened. And then afterwards, now that they've happened, how many of us would be willing to go back to the age before social networks, before the internet, before cloud mobile, where a device in my hand that, frankly, I can lose it, it can be taken from me today, and in a few hours, I'll have all the things that I care about on another device all over again. We can't even imagine life without it. I hear lots of people, especially in the tech world, talk about the singularity as if it's some kind of nirvana. That misses the point. The singularity it's more like a black hole, and once you pass that event horizon, you can't see beyond it. Once you're inside it, you realize there's no going back. We already had at least 3 major examples of this as human societies evolved. And we're already at the point where it's too late to go back to a world without networks, a world without the internet, a world without social networks. Now, what's happened? The critical resource in each age has been different. Now, it's not that arable land is suddenly unimportant. It's that back in the agrarian age, that was the critical resource, that wars were fought over, that governance was created to manage, right? As we got into the industrial age, critical resource is capital. Now, I've heard a lot of talk about how important it is to get capital here into Pakistan, and that's not wrong, but it's industrial age thinking. And I want to point out that if you really want to advance, you should leapfrog. You should move away from industrial age thinking and understand what's the critical resource of the network age. It's attention and engagement. It's human attention and engagement. That is more precious than capital. That's more precious than arable land. Now, that may seem counterintuitive, and it may not be as big a factor in societies that haven't moved as far along, but certainly I think you can find plenty of evidence that that's already true here in Pakistan. And I want to point out that, just by way of example, you can't understand what's happening in global politics unless you understand that the new scarcity is attention and engagement. And if you want to understand what's happening in the US, all you got to do is look at what's happening politically with US attention and engagement. Donald Trump, love him or hate him, he has managed to suck all the oxygen out of the room when it comes to other politicians getting much of anything in terms of attention and engagement. And the ones that do share any kind of attention and engagement are the ones that are also talking about Donald Trump. This is the fundamental shift that we're going through in terms of what's the new critical resource, right? Now, data is a byproduct of this. You heard from Alexander Shulgin about how we're going to make use of that data, but it's a byproduct of that attention and engagement. Fractals are constructed iteratively. Just like all societies, just like all life forms, what's really cool about fractals is you zoom in to a small part of any fractal and you'll see the pattern that exists in a whole all over the place. The Mandelbrot set, you've probably seen it many, many times, even if you didn't know what it was called. It's a very simple equation. You just iterate, n being the iteration that you're on, and if as you iterate on a particular point in this mathematical plane, the real and the complex are the x and the y here in terms of the graph. If that point starts escaping, diverging, it's on the outside of the set. If it stays within a particular value, it doesn't diverge, then it's on the inside. Well, it turns out that you don't get a simple graph when you look at the Mandelbrot set. In fact, here's a little zoom in on the Mandelbrot set. You may have seen this. Now, what's interesting is you'll see little copies of the Mandelbrot set within the Mandelbrot set. Lungs are like this. Cauliflower is like this. There are lots of natural examples of this. But can you imagine such a simple equation generating such complex results? This is why fractals, why life really exists along the fractal boundary. And what I want to do to demonstrate this is I've zoomed in on just one little corner of the Mandelbrot set. Of course, what we do is we color it to make it look more interesting. Otherwise, you're just dealing with something that isn't so clear. We have this illusion. All of us believe that, for instance, we're interacting with reality. You're not. You're at least 200 microseconds behind. By the way, your eyes can only sense one color at a time. All the colors that you're seeing in this room, those have been constructed in your head. That's model in your head. Reality is infinitely complex. And I'm going to iterate here a little bit. With each new iteration, you'll notice that I get a little bit more richness of detail. Is this still a simple line? When you zoom in on the edge of the Mandelbrot set, this is a perfect example of this is how life is. As you get deeper into reality, you discover that it's more complex than you can manage in your head. And that's the way life is, right? It's more complex than the models in our head. What we have in our head is just a model. The map is not the terrain. What are the implications of this? How do we use that to more effectively create value and build networks, right? There are some really simple implications here. First of all, anything that is built up iteratively is going to show fractal patterns. In other words, the weather, the input to tomorrow's weather is today's weather. In fact, it's continuously input. Markets are the same way, right? Individuals, group, corporations, nations, all of these things are fractal in nature. The way we deal with that fractal nature is we deal with the iteration that's in front of us, then we adjust over and over and over again. This is why self-driving cars aren't quite so simple for the machines, but they're relatively straightforward for humans, right? This adjustment is going to create conditions that either you've got mild or balanced conditions, and those conditions, that's the part, for instance, inside the Mandelbrot set, where you can predict, you can see what's going to happen. The interactions are very understandable. Or you get wild or unbalanced conditions where you get amplification effects, momentum effects. Those can't be predicted easily. And if you don't understand what you're dealing with, and markets are very much like this, you can go from a mild condition to a wild condition very fast, and all the models that you had that worked in mild conditions completely out the window, right? You got to have lots of data points, like nodes in a network, and the accuracy drops off quickly. But even under wild conditions, you can still predict a number of things. Now, I want to shift gears just a little bit to talk about value networks. What I mean by value networks is there's a socioeconomic pattern that has existed from the beginning of time. All human and social and economic activity is fundamentally networked. We do this without even thinking about it, right? What is this value network, right? It's a set of participants, whether those are people or organizations, companies, right? It doesn't matter what level you're dealing with that at. And the reason why I call it fractal networking is whether you're zooming in at a really low level or you're zooming out looking at entire industries or nations or global economies, right? You're going to see these same patterns. There's value networks made up of participants, right? There's state and hierarchy, certain degree of transparency. There's a shared context that each value network has. There's a mission and a charter that either formally or loosely in terms of a shared value defines what that is. It doesn't have to be economic, but here's some classic examples of business value networks, right? If you're selling something, you might use sales and channel partners to do more than what you could do directly, promoters and influencers. And maybe you make use of professional provider networks, or you manage that if you're in the insurance business. Certainly, if you're in manufacturing, you've got a supply chain. If you're in technology and building software, you're trying to attract developers and integrators, right? These are all examples of value networks. But the value networks could be around charitable causes. They could be around religion. They can be around educational institutions. What's important to understand is you can map the deliverables, the relationships, the flow of value between value networks and within a value network between the participants in that value network. And never underestimate the value of the intangible deliverables that exist. Those intangible deliverables, in some cases, can drive more value than the actual financial tangible deliverables. If you want to understand what's going on, what's driving those networks, you need to enumerate them, right? Measure those deliverables. Find the feedback loops. How are you getting feedback? And how is that feedback amplifying what's happening there? This is how you grow those, right? Each participant in a value network is following these journey steps at their own pace, but those journeys are typically well-defined. If you're the one trying to grow the value network, how easy are you making it for those participants to understand that journey and engage on that journey with you? You know, this is something that we naturally do, but we rarely think about how we can scale. If you close those feedback loops, and basically if you look at any successful organization, what builds their success is their ability to scale value networks on very large scale. They might do that by throwing lots of people that manage partnerships, for example, or they might do it by having very clear, transparent means of engaging, right? The way that a company like Google, where I worked for 5 years, the way they develop their value networks is very different from the way that, say, a cigarette company develops their value networks and their resellers. The number of people that are involved with the latter is very large, right? With Google, it might be a very, very small team. These APIs get used by millions, and yet there's only a few people out there publishing it, right? Value networks are fundamentally fractal as any of the other examples. Now, when I say they're fractal, I don't mean that it's just this infinite loop and everything looks the same except at a different zoom level. What I mean is the process by which they grow is fully iterative, right? It's a simple process that is done at scale, and it leads to very complex ecosystems. But if you look at the underlying dynamics, they're relatively straightforward. They can be captured, right? So I'm going to leave you with 3 steps to improve the fractal networking power that you have either as a person or as an organization, right? The first, build strength via network attention and engagement. That's perishable. You got to use it or lose it, but this is the source of strength. If you have that attention and engagement, and you're amplifying that attention and engagement, then you're creating value. That value can be multiplied massively if you have authentic engagement. We live in this age it's temporary, where the paid influencers are a big thing, right? That's only going to last so long. I think it's going to become really obvious who's getting money for what, and the authentic influencers are going to be the ones that are, in the long term, creating the most value. But in order to engage authentic influencers, you've got to be more authentic with your value networks that you're engaging, right? Sustained passion always overcomes cold calculus. Now, notice that I said sustained passion, right? It's not just banging out a tweet once in a while. This is ongoing engagement. You want to understand what's happening in American politics, what you've got is cold calculus for years and years and years, and then you get somebody that comes in and makes an emotional connection with the disaffected. Whether he's authentic or not matters not as much as it does that he's making that connection, right? He's making a connection with someone who is outside the political system, and that's going to win over the calculated politics that are the alternative, right? And until the opposition in the US gets an authentic alternative to that reaches the disaffected, Trump's going to continue to win. At this point, I think he's going to get reelected, right? Third lesson, continuously align your value creation journeys with your network participants. This is the essence of value network orchestration. I've got a startup that's involved in this. We're very early days. But this is the essential engine that will separate the leaders in the network economy from the followers. So take a moment when you have a chance, think about the fractal networks that are around you and how you can make use of them. Feel free to reach out to me. Thank you very much.